Tonight, friends, we're starting by stepping into a medieval castle, where our footsteps bounce off echoing stone corridors. Torches tremble along the walls, and you can almost catch the thin whistle of wind slipping through cracks in those heavy wooden doors. It's the kind of place that feels romantic when you're visiting as a tourist. But if you actually had to live here, especially on a winter night, you'd likely regret it before the first hour was even over. The truth is simple: castles were brutally cold. And if you were forced to sleep inside one without central heating, insulated windows, or even a truly decent bed by modern standards, you'd quickly realize your biggest enemy wasn't a rival knight. It was the cold itself. You probably wouldn't make it through. Not, at least, without a few clever tricks. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And if you're listening right now, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where people are tuning in from around the world. Now dim the lights, slow your breathing, and picture yourself getting ready to sleep in a medieval castle. You're moving across the stone-laid floor of a great hall, and your boots scrape against surfaces worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Even fully dressed, the chill bites at your skin. Stone walls don't just resist warmth, they swallow it whole. Historians often call castles marvels of defense, but almost never marvels of comfort. And here's the painful reality. Those thick walls that could withstand a battering ram also trap the cold inside, turning the place into a gigantic refrigerator. Once the sun went down, the temperature inside dropped almost as fast as it did outdoors. You'd notice your breath blooming into little clouds in front of your face. The air inside would feel heavy, damp, and unwelcoming. Castles weren't designed to keep warmth in, they were designed to keep enemies out. Architects planned moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits. Insulation barely existed in their thinking. It's worth remembering a common fact: many northern European castles were strategically built on windy hilltops. From a military perspective, that was brilliant. You could spot invaders early, and the slopes gave you a real defensive edge. But for anyone trying to sleep, it was a complete curse. The wind hammered every surface and forced icy drafts inside through shutter gaps and under doors. If you tried to design a worse sleeping environment, you'd struggle to top this one. You might assume fireplaces would save you, but they didn't. Even a roaring blaze in the great hall warmed only a small circle around it. The farther you stepped from the flames, the colder it got. And when you headed toward your bedchamber, the temperature felt less like a home and more like a cellar. Here's a strange detail: some late medieval accounts mention travelers being shocked by frost forming inside castle bedrooms. Picture waking to icicles hanging from your bed curtains, or realizing your washing basin has frozen solid. Chroniclers often treated this as nearly normal, like it wasn't even worth emphasizing. If your room didn't grow a thin layer of frost in January, you were the exception. And yet people survived. Somehow, they found ways to keep their bodies from turning into ice blocks. Part of that survival was ritual. As night fell, households followed routines meant to trap every scrap of warmth they could find. A castle might have been enormous, but the nighttime goal was always to shrink the living space. Fires were reduced, beds were boxed in with curtains, clothing was layered until movement barely mattered, and everyone simply hoped the drafts wouldn't be too vicious. Now imagine stepping into a medieval bedchamber. The bed itself is an impressive piece of carpentry, raised well above the floor. That wasn't fashion, it was strategy, because the coldest air settles low. Even so, stone pushes its chill upward, and you feel it the moment you slip under the covers. Historians still argue about whether castles truly became more comfortable over the centuries. Some say wall hangings and heavy curtains genuinely made rooms warmer, while others insist the cold always won no matter how much fabric you added. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Conditions improved a little, but they never reached anything we'd call real comfort. You lie back on this imagined bed, the wooden frame creaks, and the straw-filled mattress crackles beneath you. Outside, wind slams the battlements and moans. The only light comes from a small oil lamp trembling near your head, and it looks like it's barely holding on. Your toes begin to ache with sharp cold, even though you're still wearing your daytime clothes. Then the castle's nighttime sounds rise around you. A guard's boots echo on stone during a shift change. Beams groan under the pressure of frost. Somewhere in the courtyard, a dog barks, distant and muffled by thick walls. You might even catch the faint drip of water freezing and thawing nearby. None of it makes you feel warmer, it only reminds you how cruel the world outside really is. It's tempting to imagine nobles living in perfect comfort while peasants froze in their huts. But here's the irony, sometimes peasants had it better. Their timber and mud homes could hold hearth heat far more effectively than a lord's vast stone rooms. In a small cottage, one fire could keep an entire family reasonably warm. Meanwhile, you, an aristocrat in a castle, might still shiver inside a stone box that 5 roaring fireplaces couldn't truly tame. That irony wasn't lost on people back then. Letters from some clergy and noble visitors complain about how hard it was to sleep well in castles during winter. They describe beds as magnificent, but nights as merciless. Some even advised travelers to carry an extra cloak, not for show, but for survival. The longer you picture yourself there, the more you respect the creativity it took just to get through the night. You didn't simply crawl under a blanket and hope for the best. You layered fabrics, stacked furs, sealed curtains tightly, and sometimes shared the bed with people, or animals, for extra heat. Every step was about carving out tiny pockets of warmth inside a place that nature and architecture had made relentlessly cold. That realization shifts how you see medieval life. These people weren't just warriors and lords, monks and maidens. They were specialists in survival. Every bedtime was a test, every winter a trial, and sleep, something we treat like an effortless luxury, had to be carefully constructed through rituals passed down for generations. Imagine how grateful you'd feel for the sudden warmth of a dog curling against your feet in the dark. Think of hot stones placed beside your bed as if they were treasure. Even the small victory of not waking up with frost in your beard would feel like a triumph. Moments like that would stick in your mind more vividly than any feast or hunt. Survival, after all, was unforgettable. So tonight, as you lie in your modern bed while central heating quietly hums, think about the people who once shivered in stone rooms. Their nights were long, their mornings brutal, and yet they endured. They found ways to sleep in places that should have been unlivable. And that ingenuity, layer by layer, trick by trick, is what we'll keep uncovering as this story pulls you deeper into the medieval night. Now you step into the great hall, the beating heart of every medieval castle. If the bedchamber is a drafty tomb of stone, this space at least feels alive with sparks of warmth. Long trestle tables stretch across the floor, their wood polished by countless elbows and overflowing cups. The air reeks of roasted meat, spilled ale, damp wool, and smoke that never fully leaves the rafters. At the center, a massive hearth roars, like a bright orange island of heat defying the winter darkness. This is where the castle feels most alive after sunset. People gather here not just to eat, but to soak up as much warmth as possible before retreating. Servants dart around with bread trenchers, jugs of ale, and steaming platters. Dogs weave between ankles, tails wagging, hoping for scraps. The hall is loud, almost chaotic, with laughter, songs, and knives clacking on plates. For a little while, you forget the wind howling on the walls and the frost forming on windows. The fact is, in most castles, the Great Hall was the only place where heating really did anything at all. Through winter, a huge open hearth was fed almost constantly. Logs, sometimes entire tree trunks, were dragged in to keep the fire alive. If you had status, you claimed a spot near the flames and enjoyed that golden wash of heat, while servants and the unlucky shivered at the edges. But there was a price. Even here, warmth only traveled so far. As you moved away from the fire, the air cooled quickly, as if the walls themselves exhaled frost. Heat rose and pooled up in the soot-stained beams, while people on the floor wrapped cloaks tighter and leaned into each other. In reality, only a small number were truly warm, everyone else mostly pretended. A curious detail in some chronicles is that feasts were sometimes planned as deliberate warming sessions. Nobles held their biggest gatherings in winter because hundreds of bodies plus a huge fire could make the hall feel almost warm. Some accounts even claim servants were told to stand closer together simply to generate more heat. So a feast wasn't just entertainment, it could be survival, too. But the hall's warmth never lasted. When the banquet ended, musicians packed up, and guests staggered off to their rooms. The fire was slowly reduced, embers glowed like a red refusal, and then quietly faded. The warmth you clung to all evening dissolved fast. Within a couple hours, even the great hall sank back into icy silence. Picture yourself lingering near the hearth because you don't want to leave. You hold your hands toward the last sparks, trying to absorb every remaining flicker of heat. Your cheeks flush, but your back already feels cold again. The smoke stings your eyes and clings to your hair, yet you still dread the colder rooms upstairs. Historians argue about whether some castles had more advanced systems for heating great halls. Some claim later designs used vents and flues to move warm air around. Others say that's wishful thinking, because medieval building tech didn't prioritize comfort. The harsher conclusion is common: the hall was warm only right beside the fire, and nowhere else. Even the acoustics reminded you this wasn't a cozy lodge, but a cavern built for power. Every laugh echoed, every footstep sounded bigger, and the soundscape itself could feel too vast and too cold. When the hall emptied, the silence turned oppressive, like sitting inside the belly of a sleeping giant. The most striking moment is the transition, the walk from the great hall to your bedchamber. You leave the gold glow of the fire behind and step into a narrow passage lit by a single torch. The draft hits instantly. A knife-like cold pours in through arrow slits and doors that never quite seal shut. Your breath turns to fog again. The warmth that soaked into your bones seems to get pulled out of you, as if the castle is stealing it back. That was medieval night in a sentence: brief comfort, then endless cold. Sometimes nobles lingered so long in the great hall that they nearly slept there. A high back bench near the fire became a temporary bed, and servants or guards often collapsed by the embers instead of climbing to colder rooms. Sleeping near the hearth risked sparks, smoke, and restless hours, but compared to the stone chill above, it was tempting. Another note from the records: travelers complained more about the walk from the hall to the bedchamber than about sleep itself. They said the short passage shocked the body, and the shivering lasted all night afterward. It was as if the castle punished you for thinking you'd been comfortable. The fading light of the hall mattered psychologically, too. Once you left it, you knew the night would be long and unforgiving. The great hall wasn't just a room, it was your last warming ritual before surrendering to the cold. Each torch extinguished, each final drink swallowed, was another step toward the trembling that waited in bed. Even by candlelight you could feel how temporary comfort was. A fire that once thundered now only murmured, sparks popping and dying. A servant poked the hearth without enthusiasm, then gave up and let the embers fade. The laughter and feast noises were replaced by the deep groans of a castle settling into the night. And then you had no choice but to climb the stairs, cloak pulled tight, feeling the memory of warmth fade with every step. The great hall's glow stayed in your mind like a dream you wanted to keep. But your toes were already numb, your fingers stung, and you understood the rest of the night would be a battle for heat. That brief glow is what kept people going. The ritual of gathering, feasting, and warming in firelight before the cold took over again. Without the great hall, the castle would have been unbearable. With it, people at least got a few hours to remember what warmth felt like. Now you move deeper into the castle, climbing higher and farther from the dying light of the great hall, and the air changes at once. The fire's warmth disappears, replaced by a damp cold that sinks straight into bone. The walls are thick, thicker than anything you'd see in a modern home. Sometimes there were 12 feet of stone between you and the outside world. At first, that sounds like protection. But the irony is that the same walls that stopped arrows and siege engines also trapped the cold inside. If you've ever stepped into a basement in winter, you know that feeling. Stone holds on to cold like a memory, and it keeps radiating chill even after the outdoors briefly warms. Medieval builders understood strength and permanence, not comfort, and so these walls became a paradox. They were a fortress against people, not against weather. Historians agree on one point: castles barely heated at all beyond a small zone around the hearth. The fire could blaze and the smoke could rise, but 10 steps away you were back in freezing air. Accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families sitting right in front of the flames. They pulled cloaks up over their heads, while servants behind them stamped their feet to keep blood moving. The fire created a tolerable bubble of warmth, but the surrounding stone refused to yield. A telling note from travel journals is that some people complained the walls sweated. Moisture condensed on the cold stone and ran down in thin streams. Imagine trying to sleep while you hear tiny drops hitting the floor all night long. That's not exactly a soothing lullaby. In some seasons, moss even grew on interior walls. So yes, you lived in a castle, but at times it felt more like a cave. Modern researchers still debate whether tapestries and wall hangings truly worked. We picture rich fabric covering every surface, but did it actually insulate, or was it mostly decoration? Some argue they seriously reduced drafts and created warmer pockets behind the cloth. Others insist that's romantic exaggeration, because freezing air pouring through glassless windows and leaky doors couldn't be defeated by textiles. The argument continues, but it proves one thing clearly: people were desperate, and they were willing to try nearly anything. Picture this scene. You step into a bedchamber in late January. The fireplace is small, maybe already fading. The walls rise around you like cliffs, their surfaces wet with condensation even under layers of wool. You shudder instinctively. In the middle stands the bed, proud and heavy, surrounded by thick curtains. Inside those curtains, the air might be a few degrees warmer, a small cocoon carved from the cold. But outside them, the room feels like a stone grave. The psychological weight was as heavy as the physical cold. People wrote that they feared cold more than hunger or sickness. Hunger and sickness could eventually pass. Cold returned every night, ruthless through the whole winter. Living in a castle meant you couldn't escape it. Feeling like a prisoner inside your own home leaves a mark. Imagine lying there, pulling the cover tight, listening to the wind hiss through arrow slits. Your ears burn from cold. Your fingers stiffen. And even your dreams, when they come, feel haunted by images of ice and fire. Stone surrounds you not like a shield, but like a refrigerator that never shuts. And here is where the perspective truly shifts. Castles weren't glamorous in everyday life. Yes, they were machines of survival, but they demanded a price from the people inside. Comfort was sacrificed for security. And every winter night reminded you that stone could stop arrows, but it couldn't keep you warm. The more you think about it, the clearer it becomes. Sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't peaceful rest, it was a small war against your surroundings. The enemy was invisible, but it was merciless. And the battlefield was always the same: your room, your bed, your body. Tonight, you shuffle across the room, and instead of rugs or polished wood, your boots crunch over something far humbler: rushes scattered across the stone floor. These weren't decoration. They were a practical attempt to soften the cold underfoot, soak up spills, and, most importantly, serve as a crude form of insulation. Late medieval records mention households replacing these rushes a few times each year, laying them down thickly in noble halls and chambers. When freshly spread, they released a light, outdoorsy scent, grassy, earthy, almost pleasant. For a brief moment, it could feel as if a piece of summer had been carried indoors. The plants padded the floor, muffled footsteps, and helped hold on to whatever tiny warmth could cling close to the ground. But that charm never lasted long. Over time, the rushes turned nasty. Food crumbs, spilled ale, and stray feast bones worked their way into the layers. Mice and insects treated the floor like a playground. If you're imagining a clean, natural carpet, think again. By the end of winter, the rushes could be so filthy that one French moralist complained it was like sleeping in a rubbish heap. What's striking is how the rushes did two jobs at once. Yes, they trapped a thin layer of warmth, but they also absorbed dampness rising off cold stone. In a castle where condensation dripped constantly from the walls, that mattered. Otherwise, every step would be over slick flagstones and icy puddles. Some English household accounts add an odd little note. Lavender, rosemary, or meadow flowers were sometimes scattered through the rushes. Part of the idea was practical. Strong-smelling herbs covered the stench of rotting leftovers, but they also offered a tiny comfort in rooms thick with smoke and damp. Imagine climbing into bed and catching a faint trace of lavender beneath the crushing smell of wet wool and wood smoke. It wouldn't warm you, but it might make the night slightly easier to endure. Among architectural historians, there's still an ongoing debate about how effective rush flooring really was. Some argue it genuinely helped by creating an insulating layer between human feet and ice-cold stone. Others dismiss it as mostly symbolic, a gesture of order and cleanliness, because most heat loss came from walls and ceilings anyway. Either way, the evidence is patchy, and the question lingers: were rushes a medieval's warming technology, or just a messy habit dressed up as tradition? Now picture yourself in bed while a servant has just finished scattering fresh rushes across the floor. They crackle softly underfoot and release a mild scent as they are crushed. For a moment, the room feels cleaner, almost more civilized. But you know that by morning the rushes will have already sucked up dampness, and the cycle of decay will start again. Think about the sensory intensity of a room like this. Under your sheets you can feel the comfort of wool or fur. But around you, the moldy breath of old rushes, the sharp bite of herbs, and the ever-present smoke cling to everything. You hear a dry rustle as mice hunt for crumbs near the floor. Every detail reminds you that sleep here is defined by survival, not luxury. And yet there's a kind of ingenuity in it. People took the simplest materials, gathered from riverbanks and fields, and turned them into tools for making it through the long winter. They weren't thinking in terms of carpets or insulation. They were thinking in terms of anything that could push the cold back, even slightly. So when you rest your head on the pillow in this imagined chamber, you realize the floor itself is part of the nightly war against winter. The enemy is stone. The rushes are a fragile shield. And every morning begins with the same question: how quickly will damp and rot make that shield fail? Now you sit on the edge of the bed and run your fingers across the stacked layers of fabric. If medieval nights had one true survival secret, it was cloth. Wool, linen, and fur were layered and wrapped until you looked less like a sleeper and more like a cocoon. Household inventories make it clear that textiles sat at the very center of medieval life. Linen sheets were considered the basic layer, smooth and cool on the skin, but far less insulating than what went on top. Above that came thick wool blankets, so heavy that some compared them to the weight of a hunting dog. And if you had money, you added fur, fox, sable, even bear. Nobles invested fortunes in this bedding not just for display, but because without it winter nights could be lethal. There's also a quietly funny note hidden in the sources. Servants sometimes mocked their masters for being unable to move in bed. So many layers pinned them in place that turning over became a serious effort. Imagine being wrapped in 5 or 6 heavy blankets, tucked so tightly that you either lie still or risk pulling the covers open and inviting freezing air inside. Warmth came at the cost of mobility, and most people accepted the trade. Fur deserves special attention. Beyond luxury, it was genuinely practical. Arctic fox, marten, and sheepskin could deliver dense warmth. One chronicler claims a noblewoman in Burgundy refused to travel without ferret fur-lined coverings, fearing chills even in summer. It sounds absurd to us, but in an age when drafts sliced through every room, cold paranoia was completely rational. In some households, a strange belief emerged. Some people thought too much linen was unhealthy because it pulled heat from the body. To balance that, they deliberately built wool or fur layers above and below, something like a medieval textile sandwich. The logic went: linen cools, wool warms, and fur traps everything inside. Was that theory scientifically correct? Probably not. But it shows how people blended practical comfort with folk belief. Scholars still argue about the social meaning of these textiles. Was fur mainly about survival, or mostly about status? On one hand, inventories prove wealthy nobles owned multiple fur bed sets. On the other, poorer families survived without them, relying on coarse wool instead. Some historians say furs were primarily symbols of power and rank, others insist they were critical necessities in drafty castles. The most likely answer sits between both. They were life-saving tools, and they were prestige at the same time. Now imagine yourself under those layers. The wool feels rougher than modern fabric, lightly itching your skin. Above it, the fur is dense and almost suffocating, but it keeps the cold at a distance. The sheer weight of the blankets presses you down into the straw mattress. You shift, but only slightly. A bigger movement would invite icy air into your cocoon. Your breath warms the small space around your face, while the rest of your body depends entirely on the barrier of cloth. In the silence, every sensation grows louder: the rustle of linen, the drag of coarse wool, the faint musky scent of animal hide. There's something intimate and primal about it. You're wrapped in the skins and fibers of the natural world. Every thread and every hair reminds you that survival depends on turning the environment itself into armor. And that's the core of medieval sleep. Rest meant building a second fortress inside the fortress, made not of moats and stone, but of sheets and fur. Each night you used every textile you owned to barricade yourself against the cold. Without that, even the grandest castle room would feel like the inside of a tomb. So lying in this imagined cocoon, you begin to understand the ritual: gather layers, surrender to weight, and hope it holds until morning. The cold can rattle shutters, seep through stone, and circle your bed like a predator, but inside your fabric fortress, you at least have a fighting chance. The bed itself was more than simple furniture. It was a machine designed to create a small, livable climate inside an otherwise hostile room. When you pull back the heavy curtains of a medieval canopy bed, you're not just peeking into someone's private sleeping space. You're stepping into a micro-world built for survival. Detailed inventories from noble households show just how important these beds were. Unlike peasant pallets, these frames stood raised from the floor, sometimes as tall as a person, carved from oak or walnut. Posts rose like pillars, often decorated, lifting a canopy above. That canopy wasn't merely ornamental, it was functional. When curtains dropped along the sides, your body heat stayed trapped inside. It could turn an icy room into something that at least resembled warmth. Think of it like pitching a medieval tent inside your bedroom. Once the curtains were drawn, the change could feel dramatic. Heat from your breath, your body, and thick bedding accumulated inside a tight space, even if the room outside hovered barely above freezing. A few degrees might be the difference between a miserable night and a survivable one. There's a neglected record claiming a French duchess had her bed dismantled and hauled in wagons wherever she traveled. Why endure that trouble? Because the bed wasn't just furniture. It was life support. Without your canopy and curtains, sleeping in an unfamiliar castle or monastery meant gambling on an all-night shiver. Some English sources include a curious detail. Curtains were sometimes waxed or lined with oiled cloth to block drafts more effectively. Picture yourself pulling them closed. The fabric is heavy, faintly smelling of resin or wax. They didn't only stop cold. They also created darkness, muted sound, and offered an illusion of privacy in rooms that rarely had any real privacy at all. Modern researchers still debate how effective these beds truly were. Did they measurably warm the sleeper, or did later storytelling exaggerate their benefits? Archaeological evidence shows curtains were thick and layered, so there's reason to believe they helped. Still, some argue the warmth was as much psychological as physical, feeling enclosed and protected inside a massive cold space. The debate continues, but one thing is certain: people believed in them strongly enough that portable beds became a noble necessity. Now imagine sliding into one. The frame creaks under your weight. The straw mattress crackles. Then you reach out and pull the curtain shut. Immediately, the air feels different. It's still cold, yes, but you're no longer being attacked by drafts from arrow slits. Your breath fogs less. Your body settles deeper into layered bedding, and sleep feels possible. The curtain dulls the drip of water, the distant cough of a servant in the corridor, even a dog barking outside. Inside, the scent is cloth and fur, slightly musky, but oddly comforting. When you shift, you hear only the whisper of blankets. Outside, the room may be vast and unlivable. Inside, you've carved out a pocket of life against nature. It wasn't perfect. On some nights, curtains stiffened with frozen condensation and crackled like paper. On others, smoke from the hearth leaked in and woke you choking. But for most nobles, a four-poster canopy bed was the best defense available against the cold siege of night. And this is where you see medieval cleverness, not in grand inventions, but in small, smart adaptations. No central heating? Build your own climate bubble. No insulation? Hang thick curtains and seal yourself in. Every night was a negotiation with the cold, and the canopy bed was the closest thing to a truce. So picture yourself there, eyelids heavy, the world beyond the curtain falling silent. The room is still cold, the castle still drafty, but you've built a space where survival feels possible. You drift towards sleep not because the night became warm, but because wood and cloth let you win a few degrees. Even under all those blankets and curtains, the foundation of your rest was still the mattress itself. What you lay on could decide whether you woke in tolerable discomfort, or in pain, shivering, and foul-tempered. Medieval bedding came in many forms, but two stood out: the feather bed and the straw mattress. Feather beds were the luxury option. Imagine sinking into a sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, soft, springy, wrapping your body in warmth. Noble inventories list multiple feather beds, carefully stored and transported when a lord traveled. A well-filled feather mattress could be so thick it rose nearly a foot above the frame, like a bouncing cushion in an otherwise merciless room. Families prized them, protected them, and passed them down as valuable heirlooms. They weren't just comfortable. They were status. But here's the twist: feather beds could also become oppressively hot. They trap body heat so effectively that sleepers sometimes woke sweating in the middle of winter. A surviving 15th-century letter preserves a guest's comic complaint that a host's bed swallowed him like a goose in a pot. Too much feather meant sinking too deep, spending the night trying to climb back to the surface. Still, most people would gladly accept that problem. For many, the real reality was the straw mattress, a large sack stuffed with straw, hay, or rushes, packed tight enough to form a rough bed. Peasants used them, soldiers used them, and lower castle rooms were full of them. They were cheap, easy to replace, and moderately effective at lifting you off ice-cold floors. But straw had its own curses. It flattened quickly, poked through fabric, and often carried fleas. Households had to beat these mattresses regularly, literally thumping and shaking them to fluff the filling and drive pests out. By morning your body might itch with straw scratches, but at least you'd made it through the night. Sources mention another odd detail. Some people mixed herbs into the straw, not only to improve smell, but to repel pests. Lavender, mint, or pennyroyal were added, leaving a sharper note over the sour dampness. If you've ever slept on straw, you know that scent never fully disappears. It's earthy and moldy, and it clings to hair and clothes. Researchers still debate how common feather beds really were. Some argue they were rare luxuries reserved for the top tier of society. Others point to records suggesting even middling households owned at least one feather bed, implying they were more widespread than we assume. The disagreement exists because evidence is fragmented, but it shows one thing: what you slept on mattered enough to be carefully recorded. Now imagine yourself lying on a straw sack in a drafty room. It crackles beneath you, uneven lumps pressing into your back. Every shift releases a puff of grassy odor mixed with the sharper edge of the herbs inside. You hear tiny scurrying somewhere in the rushes on the floor and wonder whether mice will pay you a visit. The heavy blankets press down, but the straw beneath you reminds you that comfort was never guaranteed here. Now imagine the alternative: a feather bed in a noble chamber. You sink into softness, your body hugged by down. It feels heavenly, until the warmth turns stifling and you slide into a hollow too deep. You push the blankets aside, searching for fresh air, but the curtains keep everything trapped. And still you fall back asleep, because even the discomfort beats straw by a mile. The choice between straw and feathers mirrored medieval social hierarchy. Sleeping on feathers meant privilege. Sleeping on straw meant necessity. Yet both were answers to the same problem: keeping a body alive in cold, brutal stone rooms. So tonight, as you drift in this imagined bed, you realize medieval people were never passive. Every mattress, humble or luxurious, was an effort, an adaptation, and a small victory against the cold. You didn't just collapse into bed. You made a deliberate, tactical choice. You either sank into feathers or endured straw, all for the hope of surviving until dawn. Even the most carefully prepared bed, curtains drawn, feather mattress laid, blankets piled high, couldn't guarantee survival by itself. On the coldest nights, what mattered most wasn't furniture. It was company. Sleeping alone in a stone chamber meant your heat simply bled into the walls. Sleeping beside others meant warmth multiplied. Bodies pressed together in the dark, acting like human radiators. Noble families understood this, even if they rarely admitted it out loud. Servants often slept in adjoining rooms, or on pallets at the foot of the master's bed. Tonight, that routine isn't only about service or security. It's also about basic physics. The more people you pack into one space, the warmer it becomes, even if it's only by a few precious degrees. At first, you might not even notice the change. But when midnight arrives and frost begins to bloom on the inside of the shutters, every extra body suddenly matters. Records from medieval monasteries show monks sleeping side by side in drafty dormitories, arranged in long rows. Their benches or straw pallets were set so close they nearly touched. The reason wasn't only communal discipline. It was also about staying alive. In a crowded hall, shared body heat created a thin insulating layer, however slight. The same logic applied in winter barracks. Soldiers pressed together in lines, pulled cloaks tight, and trusted that as a group they could resist the cold better than alone. A memorable anecdote comes from a 14th century manor in England. In one nobleman's will, he specifically orders that his favorite comrade-in-arms be given a place at night near the Lord's chamber fire. Researchers read this not just as a compliment, but as an admission that the warmth of companionship could be as valuable as inheritance. Being invited to share a bed, or even a room, wasn't only intimacy. It was access to heat. And of course, there was another layer to this strategy: animals. Dogs, especially, became living heaters. The phrase "a three-dog night" may be later folklore, but the underlying idea matches reality. Medieval people often brought their hounds into bed, not merely for affection, but because animals radiated warmth. Two large mastiffs curled at your feet could mean the difference between numb toes and real relief. Some travelers even recorded inns where guests slept tightly wedged beside dogs, goats, and occasionally sheep. The smell was powerful, but warmth usually won that argument. Scholars still debate how socially acceptable bed sharing was among elites. Some argue it was routine: lords with trusted companions, ladies with attendants, travelers with strangers when necessary. Others claim that among the upper classes, such closeness was limited and carefully managed, with servants directed to nearby pallets rather than under the same covers. What's clear is that among the lower classes, sharing was normal. Families piled together, parents, children, and often grandparents, tangled under a single mound of blankets. When survival is on the line, privacy becomes a luxury you can't afford. Now imagine yourself in a bed like that. You're not alone, but squeezed shoulder to shoulder with others. The first few minutes feel awkward. Elbows jab. Someone coughs. A blanket slips. But then the temperature climbs. A shared cocoon of body heat forms. You feel the weight of a dog pressed against your feet, hear the soft breathing of the people beside you, and your muscles begin to loosen. The castle can howl with wind all it wants. Inside this cluster, you almost believe in comfort. Of course, there were costs. Fleas and lice spread easily, and whispers in the dark carried secrets. But if you weigh those discomforts against the risk of shivering through a sleepless night, the choice becomes simple. You pick warmth over pride, and companionship over solitude. To a modern mind, sharing a bed with servants, siblings, or animals can sound unsettling. But for a medieval sleeper, it was a practical survival method, passed down and treated as common sense. In a world of stone and frost, every extra body was a gift. So tonight, when you pull your own blanket tighter, think of those people facing the same cold with fewer defenses. Their solution was blunt: share whatever warmth you have, and hope the night shows mercy. Now picture the moment after you blow out the candle and settle beneath the covers. What keeps you alive isn't only blankets or bed curtains. It's also what you're wearing. Instead of changing into pajamas, or sleeping with nothing at all, many medieval people went to bed almost as wrapped up as they were during the day. Clothing became part of the insulation system. Household records and surviving garments suggest that a common bedtime layer was the night shirt. It was loose, long, and shaped like an oversized tunic. Linen might not sound warm, but it was the practical choice. Compared to wool, it washed more easily, felt smoother on the skin, and breathed better. Over it, depending on how vicious the cold was, someone might add a wool tunic, or even keep a cloak on. To the medieval mind, more layers usually meant more safety. But one item stands out in particular: the nightcap, or coif. These were small cloth caps tied under the chin or fitted snugly over the head. Why protect the skull so carefully? Because people believed, quite reasonably, that much of your heat escaped from your head. A sleeper without a coif was like a knight without armor, dangerously exposed. Even illuminated manuscripts show figures tucked into bed with neatly covered heads, looking less like dreamers and more like travelers ready to depart. The nightshirt itself varied by class. Poor families wore what they had; often a daytime undertunic simply became sleepwear again. Wealthier nobles, meanwhile, could commission finer sleeping garments, embroidered linen, or even pieces trimmed with fur. Some ladies supposedly owned elaborate caps with ribbons and trailing ends, though it's doubtful those were truly practical. Whatever the fashion, the rule stayed simple: cover everything you can. A 15th-century medical text even advises wrapping the feet at night with linen or wool against the night air. That wasn't mere style. It shows an early awareness that extremities freeze first. Before bed, people bound toes, ankles, and sometimes hands with strips of cloth, improvised socks and mitts made from whatever was available. You can almost feel it: hands bundled, feet cocooned, every inch of skin defended against the bite of cold stone. There's still debate about how widespread dedicated sleep clothing really was. Some researchers argue peasants didn't have separate nightwear at all, simply collapsing in whatever they wore by day. Others point to wills and inventories that mention night linens explicitly, suggesting that at least middle and upper households treated sleep garments as standard. Both can be true depending on region and status. But everyone agrees on one point: staying covered at night was not optional. Now imagine yourself preparing this way. You remove heavier outer layers, pull on a long linen shirt, and tie a cap down over your ears. The air bites at your neck until you haul the blankets up. Every fiber adds a tiny defensive layer, and together they form a usable cocoon. The bed may still be drafty and the room may still be icy, but your body has become a cloth fortress. The sensory details are sharp. Linen feels cool and slightly textured at first, then warms as your skin heats it. Wool carries a comforting earthy smell: lanolin, sheep, and storage trunks. The cap gently compresses your head, muffling sound and making you feel contained. You wriggle into position like a wrapped package and wait for sleep to take you. And sleepwear served another purpose besides warmth: modesty. In a world where bed sharing was common, being half-dressed, or naked, could be unacceptable. Manuscript illustrations often show even married couples in bed wearing long shirts and caps. The point wasn't only survival. It was propriety. So whether you were a lord, a lady, a servant, or a soldier, the nightshirt and coif had a social function as well as a practical one. Think about the rhythm of these nights. It wasn't undress and relax. It was the opposite: dress and prepare. More cloth, more knots, more adjustments, then the light goes out. In modern life, sleepwear signals comfort. For a medieval sleeper, it was a kind of armor against nature. Now hold that thought and picture the moment just before you slide under the covers. A servant steps forward carrying a long-handled pan. Its brass surface catches the firelight in a dull gleam. Inside, hot embers hiss and crackle, filling the room with the smell of ash and heated metal. This odd object is a medieval bed-warming pan, simple, dangerous, and brilliant, because nobody wants to climb into sheets that feel like ice. The routine is straightforward. The servant slides the pan between the bed linens, moving it back and forth so heat leaks through small openings and warms the cloth. The top sheet lifts slightly with trapped air, and the room fills with a sharper edge of smoke and burnt wood. For a few minutes, the bed changes from a frozen slab into something almost inviting. Without this step, you might shiver for an hour before your own body heat finally softened the cold. Inventories from noble households list bed warmers alongside candlesticks and chamber pots as normal tools of night life. They weren't rare curiosities. They were expected equipment. By the late Middle Ages, many prosperous homes across Europe treated them as a winter necessity. If a household didn't have one, it either meant neglect or that its status didn't justify such a luxury. But the hazards were real. Letters from the period complain about servants holding the warmer too long, leaving linens blackened with soot, or even setting them alight. Imagine sliding into bed and finding a smoking hole where clean linen should be. Half-comic, half-tragic stories survive of men leaping up in the night as sparks from a warming pan caught blankets in rooms full of dry rushes and timber. Those accidents weren't harmless. In a medieval building, one careless spark could become catastrophe. There's even an especially strange Italian note describing people sprinkling aromatic herbs directly onto the embers before warming the bed. They believed the lingering smoke purified the air and pushed sickness away. You can almost smell it, the sharp ember scent in the sheets, mixed with rosemary and lavender. Here, practical warmth and superstition fused into one nightly act, fighting cold and invisible illness at the same time. Experts still argue about how common warming pans truly were. Some say they belonged mostly to high-status households, too costly and risky for ordinary people. Others argue that simpler versions, like earthen pots wrapped in cloth, filled with coals, were widespread in middling homes. Because modest objects rarely survive intact, the truth is hard to pin down. Still, one point is hard to deny: across social classes, people found some method to pre-warm the bed, even if the tool changed. Now imagine yourself watching it happen in your room. The servant moves the pan in steady strokes, a faint mist rises as moisture lifts from the linens. When the pan is removed, the air under the covers is unexpectedly warm, almost shocking after the bitter room. You slip in quickly, like you're trying to trap the heat before it escapes. For a short time, that cocoon feels like heaven. But it never lasts. The warmth fades fast, and the castle's relentless cold creeps back in. The goal was never to keep you comfortable all night. It was to make the first moments bearable, so you could relax, so exhaustion could beat the shivering, and so your own body heat could take over. The warming pan becomes a symbol of compromise. It doesn't solve winter, but it buys you a beginning. It's a bargain with the night: give me a few minutes of comfort, and I'll endure the rest. And as you drift off with the faint scent of embers still trapped in the fabric, you realize how ritualized medieval sleep really was. Every evening had its choreography, tools, clothing, movements, and small tricks layered together. Now shift again in your imagined bed. You pull heavy blankets closer when you feel a weight press into your legs. Warm, solid, and alive, something nestles into the bend of your knees, sighs with satisfaction, and settles in. It isn't another person. It's a dog, maybe two, and if you're lucky, even three. Sharing the bed with animals was not unusual. Dogs weren't just guards or hunting companions. They were heaters. Their thick coats held warmth, and their loyalty meant they stayed close through the longest hours of darkness. A castle room that felt like an ice cave could become noticeably more bearable with a few hounds curled at the foot of the bed. Late medieval wills and household accounts sometimes mentioned small lapdogs given to noble women, not only for companionship, but for warmth at night. These comfort dogs, as we'd call them today, were pampered, brushed, sometimes scented, yet their most important job was driving back the cold. Larger breeds would stretch out like furry logs at the bottom of the bed, guarding toes from freezing. There's even a Scandinavian reference suggesting that winter travelers sometimes requested to sleep near animals instead of in unheated guest rooms. Horses, cattle, and sheep generated so much heat that people preferred their company to cold, empty stone. Imagine falling asleep to the steady breath of a cow, the air heavy with hay scent, while your body relaxes under the warmth of its mass, unpolished, but effective. Dogs carried another kind of comfort too. A medieval French saying claims a faithful dog keeps frost from a master's heart. It's both literal and poetic. The dog's body warmth keeps you alive, and its presence eases the mind in a dark, drafty fortress. Researchers still disagree about how universal this practice was. Some argue that in formal, rule-bound households, animals in noble beds were frowned upon, more private indulgence than open custom. Others say in rural castles and harsh frontier regions, survival mattered more than etiquette, making it commonplace. The debate often turns on whether the image of a lady sleeping with her dog is romance or reality. Now see it clearly. You're wrapped in linen and wool, curtains pulled tight, the wind screaming along the towers outside. Your toes ache until a hound presses its warmth against them. Its coat is coarse, its body heavy, and it carries the scent of outdoors, yet you accept it without hesitation. Another dog curls in, and suddenly you're cocooned not only in fabric but in living heat. There are downsides, of course. Dogs shed fur, drag in dirt, and sometimes chew hidden bones under the covers. They bring insects, and those insects move on to people. But the exchange is worth it. Compared to freezing, fleas are tolerable. Compared to sleepless shivering, dirty blankets are a fair price. The sensory mix becomes unforgettable: dog fur's earthy odor, faint smoke clinging to cloth, the crushing weight of blankets, and beneath it all the steady rhythm of another creature breathing. It's no surprise medieval people sometimes spoke of animals with near reverence. Sharing warmth meant sharing survival. The phrase three-dog night may be later, but it captures the truth well. 1 dog meant manageable cold. 2 meant serious frost. 3 meant a night sharp enough that even nobles piled every possible heat source into the bed. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, think of those people in stone fortresses, drafts everywhere, frost at the shutters, finding strength and comfort in the simplest loyalty, an animal curled close. In that small exchange of heat, humans and dogs helped each other survive countless winters. Now pull the curtain back in your mind and step out of the noble chamber. Across the courtyard, in shadowy servant quarters, a different sleep world appears. The contrast between noble and peasant sleep could be stark, but the goal stayed identical: make it through the night. And here's the surprising question: who actually slept warmer? The answer may not be who you expect. Nobles had feather beds, fur, warming pans, and heavy canopies. But grandeur didn't automatically mean comfort. Their chambers could be enormous, built as much for display as for rest, and heating that volume was almost impossible. Even with roaring hearths, stone walls drank heat like a sponge. So a lord might lie on layers of down and fur, yet still breathe air cold enough to fog in front of his eyes. In contrast, peasants lived in far humbler homes built from timber and wattle and daub, and those houses were so small that a single hearth could warm nearly the whole interior. A thatched roof, often packed and thickened with straw, acted like a rough layer of insulation. Families slept close together, and animals were often kept at one end of the room, so their combined heat made the air far more bearable than any draughty castle chamber. One visitor to an English village in the 14th century even wrote, almost surprised, that the cottages were ramshackle, yet they held warmth better than a lord's tower. Still, status shaped more than temperature. Nobles could access better materials, finer wool, imported furs, and linen that softened with each wash. Peasants made do with coarse wool, blankets patched again and again until they thinned, or rough smoked sheepskins pulled from the rafters. Their bedding reeked of lanolin and hearth smoke, excellent for blocking chill, but never elegant to look at or luxurious to touch. A small note in memorial records adds an interesting detail. Peasants sometimes slept directly on benches right beside the fire, with children curled in their laps. They accepted sparks and smoke as a risk, because proximity to the hearth offered guaranteed warmth. Meanwhile, in a noble's private bedchamber away from the great hall, that immediate, direct heat often wasn't there at all. So comfort didn't spread evenly, nor did it always land where you'd assume. Even today, researchers are still trying to map how this hierarchy of warmth actually worked in practice. Did wealth automatically buy better sleep, or did peasants endure winter nights more easily inside tight, sheltered cottages? The evidence points in both directions. Some scholars argue that the sheer volume of textiles in noble households gave them the advantage. Others insist that lower-class living, smaller rooms, shared bodies, shared heat, created a practical warmth aristocratic grandeur couldn't match. The debate remains unresolved, and it shows how sharply even sleep reflected social difference. Now picture the two scenes side by side. In the castle, a nobleman shifts beneath heavy layers, his breath curling white, while the large room amplifies every gust that strikes the shutters. In the village, a peasant family bunches together on a straw pallet near the hearth. Children press into one another like kittens, and the scent of animals drifts in from the nearby stall. One bed feels formal and decorated, the other feels crowded, earthy, and alive. So which body wakes warmer? The question hangs in the air, because there may not be a single answer for every place and every winter. Even so, nobles and peasants shared one truth: they adapted. Surviving a medieval night wasn't about perfect comfort, it was about learning tolerance and reshaping homes and habits until rest became possible. Nobles might display luxury. Peasants might rely on closeness and simplicity. But all of them slept under the same winter stars, shivering, dreaming, and inching toward morning. Tonight, as you fall asleep in your own warm bed, you can feel the irony more clearly. Status decided the decorations, but it didn't always decide the quality of medieval sleep. Sometimes the plainest cottage carried a truer warmth than the grandest hall ever could. You might assume that once a noble bed was set up, it stayed where it was forever. After all, these beds were massive objects, carved posts, heavy frames, thick curtains. But in practice, families often changed where they slept as the seasons shifted. Bedrooms were not fixed, timeless sanctuaries. They were flexible spaces chosen according to sun, fire, and wind. In other words, in winter you chased the sun, and in summer you escaped it. Documents from noble estates make this habit plain. Some castles had winter rooms and summer rooms, not for scenery, but because heat and light demanded it. During cold months, families moved into south-facing chambers where weak sunlight reached the windows for a few precious hours each day. Those walls stored a little more warmth, the air felt slightly less hostile, and waking up became marginally less brutal. When summer arrived, those sunny rooms were abandoned, and households retreated into darker, cooler chambers facing north. There's a well-recorded example in the household accounts of Edward IV. Beds and furnishings were moved with the season. Servants carried feather mattresses, linens, and wall hangings from one room to the next. Wherever the king chose to rest, they built a temporary nest around him. Logistically, it was exhausting work, but in stone palaces, mobility was part of survival. A letter from a Burgundian courtier preserves a striking complaint. He grumbles that one year he'd lost his room to frost. He describes the walls becoming so wet and cold that he refused to sleep there, choosing instead a narrower chamber that faced the rising sun. That phrasing is a reminder: in castles, the enemy was sometimes the building itself. Rooms could be taken by cold, abandoned, and then reclaimed when the season turned. Archaeologists and architectural historians still argue over whether most castles truly had multiple seasonal rooms, or whether this was a privilege of the richest estates. Some claim many castles had only a few usable sleeping chambers, forcing residents to endure whatever cold they got. Others point to window placement, fireplaces, and surviving records as signs of deliberate design for seasonal living. The debate remains unsettled, but the image is persuasive. As the weather changed, noble families migrated inside their own walls like birds shifting nests. Now imagine yourself watching this routine unfold. In autumn, you start eyeing the sunny side of the castle, knowing long nights will soon make every advantage necessary. Servants dismantle your bed, carrying its frame, mattress, and hangings piece by piece. In the new chamber, the sound of carpenters setting the posts echoes, while wall tapestries are nailed into place to blunt the drafts. When the first frost arrives, at least you're sleeping where pale sunlight will greet you in thin stripes each morning. The sensory details sharpen. You wake to the faint warmth of sun slipping through shutters. You smell the fresh-hung wool curtains. You hear servants lightly sweeping the rushes on the floor of your newly claimed room. This doesn't erase the cold. It manages it, turning the unbearable into something merely difficult. Peasants shifted sleeping places too, just in a less formal way. In winter they moved closer to the hearth and slept clustered around the fire in a single room. In summer they might retreat to a loft or even toward the stable where the air stayed cooler. In both castles and cottages, sleep was mobile, determined more by weather than by interior design. This should remind you how far medieval life was from our modern idea of a permanent bedroom. A bedroom wasn't a sacred, fixed zone. Inside a great stone structure, it was closer to a temporary camp. Beds were moved, rooms rotated, and daily life bent to the rhythm of the seasons. The castle behaved like a living thing, reshaped by light and heat, while the people inside it shifted like quiet nomads behind their own walls. And that reveals another truth about medieval sleep: it was dynamic, not static. The battle against cold demanded movement, planning, and constant adjustment. You didn't sleep wherever you pleased. You slept where the sun, wind, and dampness allowed. And as the year turned, the cycle began again. Now stand for a moment beside a narrow medieval window slit and feel the draft slide over your skin. Unlike modern homes with sealed frames and glass, castle windows were exposed holes cut into the wall. They defended against arrows, but they invited the wind. No glass, no double glazing, not even a serious concept of insulation. Many openings were covered only by shutters or stretched cloth, barely enough to keep out rain and birds. Written surveys of medieval households suggest that in many castles, glass was so rare that it was reserved for churches or the Lord's private chapel. Ordinary rooms relied on thick wooden shutters that could be bolted from the inside. In summer they stayed open for light and air, but in winter they shut tight and groaned in the wind. Yet wood alone couldn't stop the cold. Air slipped through cracks, and dampness crept in. One practical workaround was to stretch fabric across the opening, sometimes linen treated with oil or wax to make it more weather-resistant and faintly translucent. By day, that turned sunlight into a dim amber glow, soft and hazy, like brightness filtered through parchment. At night, it reduced the scream of the wind a little, but it never silenced it. The cloth snapped, the frame rattled, and sleepers learned to live with the sound of their porous fortress. A household record from 13th century France adds a curious detail. It mentions horn windows. Thin slices of animal horn were scraped until they became translucent, then fitted into wooden frames. They were rougher than cloth, but sturdier. They admitted pale light and resisted weather better, though they yellowed quickly and warped over time. Imagine peering out through one of those panels. The world outside blurs, as if seen through fogged glass. Still, inside the room, the air feels just slightly less cruel. Archaeologists and architectural historians still debate how common horn panels or oiled cloth windows really were. Some argue they were luxuries limited to the richest castles, while most homes had nothing beyond shutters. Others claim that by the late Middle Ages, they spread surprisingly widely across northern Europe. The evidence is fragmented, but the argument itself proves something important: people were desperate to invent any barrier between themselves and the cold. Now picture yourself at such a window. The shutter is closed, cloth is tacked to the frame, and yet a sharp line of frost forms along the sill. When you lean in, your breath clouds the surface like mist. Outside, snow reflects moonlight. Inside, you hear the winds moan and the wood's faint clicking as it shifts. No matter how carefully you hang bed curtains, you know the draft will eventually find you. The soundscape is unsettling. Shutters banging somewhere down a corridor. Fabric popping like a sail. Servants muttering while they stuff rags into gaps. Some households even packed moss or mud into frame joints as a crude insulation. It was messy, ugly, and temporary. But when the temperature dropped below freezing, any barrier was better than none. Peasants faced the same fight, just in a different structure. Many cottages had no true windows, only narrow vents with small shutters. Some used thin animal membranes, even bladder, stretched tight to admit a weak glow. The effect was strange. The room seemed to shine dimly, but shadows looked distorted, as if the outside world were behind a veil. At night, those coverings stiffened with frost and became brittle, translucent sheets of ice. For nobles, the irony was sharp. High towers offered status and defense, but they also caught the worst winds. Visitors sometimes joked that the higher you slept, the colder you became. A peasant in a low cottage might envy a lord's wealth, just not the whistling drafts cutting through a tower window. And yet there was beauty, too. Imagine lying in bed on a moonlit night, shutters cracked just enough for silver light to spill across the floor. Cold leaks in, yes, but the shadows become almost poetic, the silhouette of branches on a curtain, the pale glow of snow beyond. Medieval sleep balanced discomfort and wonder. Even harsh nights could offer a fragile moment of calm. So tonight, as you draw your own curtains, think about those old windows. They weren't real barriers so much as reminders. No matter how thick the walls, the night always found a way inside. Sleep wasn't about defeating the cold completely. It was about living with it, draft by draft, until morning arrived. Now imagine yourself stepping closer to the fireplace in a castle bedchamber, hoping the flames will save you. If there's fire in a stone room, you assume there must be warmth. But the reality is far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces could be enormous, with chimneys wide enough to swallow whole logs. And despite their size, they often failed at truly heating the space. The reason is simple physics. The wider the chimney, the more heat escapes straight upward with the smoke. The fire can roar, sparks can dance, logs can collapse into red embers, yet a few steps away you're still breathing white fog. A hearth creates a bright oasis of warmth right in front of it. Beyond that small zone, the castle room remains brutally cold. Household accounts underline how much wood this demanded. In a large castle, a single winter week could consume cartloads of fuel. Forest management became a constant concern, not only for building, but for burning. One French lord even complains in letters that heating his great hall devoured woodland faster than any war ever did. The fire ate resources, but it rarely delivered the comfort you'd expect. There are even jokes in the sources. Visitors sometimes mocked noble fireplaces as big enough to roast an ox, yet too weak to warm a human being. The exaggeration lands because the truth is close. These hearths offered spectacle, light, and a sense of grandeur, but they provided limited relief against stone walls that never stopped leaking cold. Some households tried upgrades. They placed iron firebacks behind the flames to reflect heat outward. They lined parts of the hearth with tile in hopes it would hold warmth longer. But these were partial fixes, fine adjustments made against a problem too large to defeat. A blazing fire could warm your feet if you sat close, while your back stayed frozen and your bed across the room felt like it belonged outdoors. Scholars still argue about how effective castle fireplaces really were. Some say that combined with hangings and heavy furniture, they formed a layered system that produced meaningful warmth. Others claim most heat vanished up the chimney, making the fireplace more symbolic than practical, about status and ritual as much as comfort. The truth likely varied from castle to castle, depending on fuel, design, and climate. Now picture yourself in that chamber. The fire crackles loudly, sparks jump against the stone, and smoke coils upward with a sharp bite in the air. Your face reddens and tingles with heat, while your shoulders stay cold. You lean closer, hands extended, almost scorching your skin. Then you retreat toward your bed, and with every step, you feel the temperature drop. When you finally slide beneath the blankets, it's like you've moved back outside. Peasants often got more benefit from their fires, simply because their spaces were smaller. In a modest cottage, one smoky hearth could warm most of the room. Tight walls meant the heat from flames and bodies had a chance to linger. Meanwhile, grand noble fireplaces consumed fuel and still left rooms half frozen. Once again, spectacle did not automatically become comfort. Yet the ritual of fire still mattered. It wasn't only about heat. It was about gathering light, and the feeling that something, anything, pushed back the dark. People prayed by the flames, told stories, and dozed in chairs nearby. Even if warmth didn't spread far, the glow offered psychological shelter, a sign of life inside a cold, stone world. So when you imagine a medieval night, don't picture a fireplace solving winter. Picture a fragile island of warmth floating in an ocean of cold, useful only as long as you stay near it, fading the moment you walk away. The hearth was both tool and performance. And medieval sleepers learned to be grateful even for the little it gave. Now step closer to that glowing hearth, because for a moment it feels almost safe. Then another truth of medieval life pushes forward: smoke. These fireplaces weren't clean, efficient machines. They belched soot, smeared walls with grime, and filled rooms with a haze that stung the eyes and settled on everything. To heat yourself meant inhaling smoke night after night. It meant accepting blackened stone, oily ceilings, and waking with lungs that felt dusted in ash. Writers of the period complain about it with weary bitterness. A monk in northern England even says his cell was so coated in soot that he spent more time coughing than praying. Nobles weren't immune either. Court records mention women upset that constant smoke dulled their clothing and stained their linen. A freshly cleaned wall hanging could turn grey after a single winter. Architecture made the problem worse. Without modern control over airflow, chimneys were wide, crude shafts. Smoke didn't always rise obediently. It rolled, swirled, and lingered in the room. If the wind shifted the wrong way, smoke poured back down and flooded the chamber, leaving everyone choking. Imagine trying to fall asleep while your throat burns, your eyes water, and the air tastes like soot. An intriguing remark in one set of travel notes claims that some people deliberately coated their walls with limewash or clay, not only to brighten the room, but also to hide the worst of the soot stains. The black film of soot never truly disappeared, yet for a little while you could restore the illusion that the place was clean. And the smell clung to everything: burnt wood, wet stone, and singed wool mixed into one stubborn perfume that sank into bedding and clothing. Scholars are still split on how bearable these smoke-filled rooms really were. Some argue medieval people simply adapted, their bodies and expectations hardened over time. Others counter that even contemporaries recognized the health cost, pointing to medical texts that repeatedly complain about choking air and lungs darkened by grime. Maybe both views are true at once. People endured because they had no choice. But they never stopped grumbling about it. Now picture yourself lying in bed after a night like that. Your hair carries the stench of smoke. Your blankets hold the sharp, biting odor of ash. When you cough, you taste bitterness on your tongue. The bed curtains trap some of it inside. So even your tiny cocoon ends up carrying the ghost of the fire. Your room might feel slightly warmer than before, but the price you pay is fresh air. Peasants didn't have it easier. In many cottages there was no proper chimney at all. Smoke rose from the central hearth, pooled among the rafters, and then slowly leaked out through the thatch. Children grew up inside homes permanently blurred by a smoky haze. Their lungs began to darken long before they reached adulthood. And yet people treated it as normal. Some even believed smoke protected the roof timbers and drove insects away. With every breath, survival and superstition tangled together. The sensory experience was overwhelming. Soot particles made your skin prickle and itch. Your eyes watered constantly, and the rushes on the floor collected a dusting of black. Servants swept again and again, but it always felt like a losing effort. Every winter brought the same bargain: a war with smoke, a war with cold, and the knowledge that improving one often worsened the other. Still, despite the discomfort, fire was not negotiable. Without it, no one could last through a castle winter. So people accepted the trade. They hung soot-stained wall hangings with a strange kind of pride. They endured coughing fits as if they were part of the season. Each morning they rubbed soot from their faces and carried on. Warmth demanded sacrifice. And the sacrifice was clean air. Tonight, as you breathe easily in your modern bed, consider how extraordinary that luxury really is. For a medieval sleeper, every warm night meant the next morning would be smoky. Their dreams were soaked in the scent of burned wood. Their lives unfolded under the shadow of soot. When the fire dwindled and the night stretched on, the last glow in a medieval room often came from a candle. You might picture that delicate flame as decor, a little atmosphere. But for many sleepers, a candle was also a fragile source of heat. One wick could never warm an entire room, of course. Yet in a world where every spark mattered, even the weakest contribution counted. Medieval candles came in several kinds. Wealthy households burned beeswax, which gave a clean, bright flame and left a faint honeyed scent in the air. It was expensive, so it was reserved for chapels, ceremonies, or noble chambers. Far more common were tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. Those sputtered, smoked, and released a greasy odor. Imagine drifting toward sleep while that sharp tallow stench thickens the air, mixing with damp stone and the musky smell of wool. But candles weren't only for light. At close range, they produced a surprising amount of warmth. Place one near a bed curtain and you might notice the fabric feels faintly warm to the touch. Some homes group several candles together on a stand, creating a small pocket of light and heat. It wasn't central heating, but inside that narrow circle it softened the edge of the cold. A letter from the 14th century tells a revealing story. A noblewoman demanded 12 candles burning at once on winter nights, insisting she could only rest that way. Servants complained about the waste, but the request exposes a truth: people used light as a substitute heater, even if the effect was modest. The dangers were obvious. A candle flame could tip easily, and bed curtains heavy with wool and linen were extremely flammable. Records mention fires started by careless placement, and entire rooms could be reduced to ash. One particularly chilling German tale describes a stableman who fell asleep with a candle on the bed rail. He woke to find his blankets burning and escaped by sheer luck. Servants blamed him for carelessness, but the deeper culprit was need. He wanted a tiny share of warmth within reach. Researchers still debate how fully medieval people understood that risk, or whether daily candle use bred dangerous complacency. Some argue that inventories listing burned textiles suggest accidents were common and quietly accepted. Others believe wealthy households reduced the risk by assigning servants to watch lights through the night. Either way, the balance between danger and comfort never stopped pressing in. Now imagine yourself in such a room. The hearth has faded to embers, and shadows crawl along the upper walls. Near your bed, a single candle burns on a small wooden table. Its light is soft and golden, forming a halo that reaches your hands as you pull the blankets tighter. That tiny warmth makes your face feel a little less like ice. The flame trembles, wax slowly pools at the edges, and a faint smoky scent lingers in the air. Beyond the curtains, the rest of the room sinks into darkness. You listen to the small sounds: the wick's quiet crackle, the wind sighing against shutters, the soft tap of wax dripping onto metal. Your whole world shrinks to this narrow ring of light and heat. The candle becomes more than illumination, it turns into a fragile ally against the vastness of the night, almost a kind of companion. In cottages and roadside inns, the same idea appeared in a simpler form. Travelers set rushlights beside straw beds, thin reeds dipped in tallow. They burned quickly and unevenly, hissing and spitting, but even that weak light offered a sense of safety. Parents lit small lamps near children, trying to chase away both cold and fear. Even monks who praised hardship allowed lamps to burn in dormitories, justified by a mix of necessity and safety. The sensory blend was unforgettable. The air smelled of melted fat and smoke. Walls wore streaks of soot that built up month after month. Bed covers collected little spots where wax had splashed. But people accepted these imperfections. In the harshest winter, a candle was more than decoration. It was survival. So tonight, as you fall asleep under clean electric light, picture that medieval flame trembling without certainty. It warmed the body just enough to persuade it toward rest. Yet every spark also carried the possibility of disaster. In the Middle Ages, sleep was never entirely calm, not even in its smallest details. Closing your eyes meant trusting that fragile flame would carry you through the night without turning warmth into ruin. When you leave noble chambers behind and step into shared sleeping halls, you see another face of medieval rest, the collective dormitory. Not everyone had heavy curtains, feather beds, or private servants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and household staff often slept in common spaces where endurance mattered more than luxury. Take a monastery as an example. Monastic rules demanded simple living. and that often meant dormitories, large rooms lined with beds or pallets set side by side. Stone floors stretched on, broken only by narrow windows high above. Each monk had a small cot or straw mattress, sometimes little more than a board with a thin pad. The beds were packed so closely that one monk could hear another's breathing. There was no privacy, but there was warmth in numbers. Surviving accounts describe these halls echoing at night with coughing, snoring, and the rasp of coarse wool blankets. The air stayed thick, cold, and damp, yet the crush of bodies helped the dormitory hold more heat than a solitary room ever could. One chronicler even notes that the monastery was warmer than the Lord's Tower, because the monks slept bundled together like sheaves. Military life was harsher still. In castles or temporary lodgings on campaign, soldiers filled barrack halls until there was barely space to move. They lay in long rows on straw pallets, with weapons piled within reach. Blankets were shared and cloaks became covers. The smell was sharp, sweat, leather, smoke, and straw blending into something almost heavy enough to touch. But for an exhausted man, even this rough companionship could feel tolerable. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder meant surviving the night. Some nightly orders even kept candles burning in common halls, not only for light, but because the flame offered comfort. Even when it added little heat, the symbol of fire mattered as much as warmth itself. Historians still argue whether communal sleep was a deliberate strategy for warmth or simply the byproduct of necessity. Some say monasteries wanted it for discipline, a constant reminder that no monk owned personal luxury. Others argue that shared warmth was a practical advantage that happened to align with spiritual ideals. With soldiers, the uncertainty repeats, was closeness about comradeship, or because the cold made solitude impossible? The most likely answer is both. Now imagine yourself lying in one of these halls. The straw crackles when you shift. Someone beside you coughs. Another man turns over. The vaulted ceiling magnifies every sound. Smoke and sweat weigh on the air, but the cold doesn't bite quite as hard as it would in a single room. Your wool blanket scratches your chin, and you pull it tighter, grateful for shared warmth even as you crave silence. The dormitory has its own rhythm, snores rise and fall like waves, and an occasional muttered dream breaks through. Somewhere a rat taps across the rushes, and no one cares enough to move. Drafts still seep from the high windows, but the collective heat blunts their edge. It isn't comfort in a modern sense, yet you are safer than you would be alone in an echoing stone chamber. Apprentices and household servants lived much the same way. Castles were full of side rooms, under stairs, in storage spaces, or tucked into small attics, where young boys and servant girls spread straw and claimed narrow corners. They layered cloaks, pressed close together, and turned humble nooks into makeshift bedrooms. They couldn't demand bedwarmers or feather mattresses like nobles could, but they did have the advantage of closeness. Their quarters were smaller, more crowded, and therefore warmer. The sensory world of these shared spaces stuck with you, rough wool against skin, the musk of packed bodies, the low hum of breathing, the whisper of straw, and the faint drip of water from above. This wasn't peace as we imagine it. It was endurance. People didn't expect silence or solitude. They expected to make it through. So tonight, in your own quiet bed, think of the long halls where monks prayed before extinguishing the lights, the soldiers laid out in rows after battle, and the servants huddled in hidden corners. Their warmth did not come from silk or fur. It came from each other. In the medieval world, sleep was as much about community as it was about comfort, a reminder that even in the coldest castles, survival was rarely a solo act. You've settled into that crowded dormitory in your mind, yet even here, warmth is never guaranteed. Someone has to remain attentive to the fire, because sooner or later a person will rise, stumble across the hall, and coax the embers back to life. medieval sleep was rarely uninterrupted. People didn't wake only because straw was uncomfortable or because a neighbor coughed, they woke because keeping the fire alive was a necessity. Their internal clock didn't expect a single, straight 8-hour block. Instead, many lived in what some scholars call segmented sleep. A first sleep came soon after dusk, lasted a few hours, and then ended around midnight. Then many people woke, sometimes to check the fire, sometimes to pray, sometimes to tend animals or children. After an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, they returned to a second sleep and rose again at dawn. In the coldest months, that middle interval often revolved around fire keeping. If the embers died, the rooms became unbearable. There's a well-known note from a 15th-century physician suggesting the gap between first and second sleep was natural, useful for thinking, talking, even intimacy. But for the castle servant forced to haul wood across an icy floor, that interval was duty, not philosophy. He listens for the crackle, blows on the coals, and hopes the flame will catch. Some rural accounts mention a simple custom: in large halls, watch duties were assigned so each adult took turns getting up to tend the fire. In monasteries, bells rang at set hours, calling monks to prayer and, conveniently, ensuring someone was always awake to monitor warmth. Sleep wasn't a private retreat from the world, it was a shared ritual sliced up by responsibility. Historians also debate whether segmented sleep was truly universal, or more common in Northern Europe where winter nights were longer. Some argue it grew from necessity; long darkness made a single sleep block impractical. Others suggest it may have been cultural and not strictly geographic at all. The debate continues, but one thing is clear: the heartbeat of those nightly rhythms was the care of fire. Now imagine waking in the dead center of night. The room is quiet except for snoring. You push the blanket aside. Cold air slaps your skin like a shock. You find a log by touch. Your feet crunch softly on straw. Your breath blooms into clouds as you stir the embers, and your hands ache with the effort. Sparks flare, the wood hesitates, then finally catches, and a thin wave of warmth begins to spread again. Relief settles in, you've bought a few more hours for everyone around you. The sensory details lock in, the pop of wood, the glow pushing shadows back, the smoke smell folding into wool. Your fingers throb, but the small satisfaction of reviving the fire steadies you. When you crawl back under the blankets, the bed feels warmer than it did before. Peasants followed a similar rhythm. Many hearths were open on the floor with no protective grate. A careless sleeper could snuff the fire, or worse, let it spread into catastrophe. Someone in the family had to rise, adjust the wood, stir the coals, and keep watch. Sleep arrived in pieces, tied to the fire's pulse. So you begin to see that medieval nights were not passive hours of unconsciousness. They were negotiated, managed, and guarded. People rose, worked, prayed, checked animals, whispered, and then returned to sleep again. Life didn't stop in the dark. It simply slowed, threaded through with firelight and breath. Today, as you lie in a warm bed, think about the constant vigilance those stone halls demanded. Closing your eyes was never absolute. To sleep meant trusting that someone would get up, feed the fire, and refuse to let the cold seize the room before dawn. You stoked the embers, slid back under the blankets, and tried to quiet the thoughts speeding through your head. But in the Middle Ages there was another path to warmth, one born less from practicality and more from a craving for luxury. For some, the idea of a hot bath before sleep lingered like a forbidden indulgence. Bathing in the Middle Ages was difficult. Heating water required a staggering amount of fuel, and tubs were large, awkward objects. So slipping into a hot bath was far from a daily habit. It was an occasion, often a communal event. Yet for those who could afford it, stepping into steaming water on a winter night felt like magic. Chronicles described noble women lowering themselves into cloth-lined wooden tubs while steam curled in the lamplight. Servants stood by with towels warmed near the fire. To leave that bath and glide into clean sheets was to feel winter briefly pushed back. A revealing note from Paris says that wealthy urban families sometimes positioned tubs close to the fireplace, so the bather emerged into a room that was already warm. The air would be rich with rosemary or thyme, thrown into the water for scent and for its supposedly healing virtues. For a short time your skin warmed, your cheeks flushed, and your body felt truly ready for sleep. Of course, that pleasure was rare. More often, people reached for smaller comforts before bed. Warm beer, spiced wine, or heated mead was a common treat. The heat spread from the inside, blooming in the chest and making the body heavy with drowsiness. Some homes heated stones by the hearth, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them at the foot of the bed. Like a crude hot water bottle, they released warmth for hours. One curious account even claims that some noble households filled leather pouches with heated sand to tuck between the sheets. Sand held heat longer than stones and could mold to the body's shape. Imagine stretching frozen feet toward that pouch and feeling the cold slowly unravel. The ingenuity is striking. Faced with hostile winters, people experimented with every material they could find. Modern historians still debate how widespread these bedtime luxuries really were. Were they occasional rewards for the very rich, or did middling households practice them in humbler forms? Some argue hot drinks and heated stones were common, within reach of many homes. Others insist they remained rare, memorable precisely because they were indulgent. Either way, the argument itself is a reminder that even comfort was a contested privilege. Now picture yourself in that imagined room. You sit by the hearth as a servant pours spiced wine into your cup. Cinnamon and clove fill the air, briefly overpowering smoke and damp wool. You sip slowly, and warmth opens inside your chest like a flower. Your eyelids grow heavy. Your limbs loosen. When you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive and more inviting. At your feet, a stone wrapped in cloth sends a faint heat toward your toes. For the first time, you don't fear the night. The sensations are vivid, the sweet, sharp spice on your tongue, the hiss of a log settling into embers, the pinprick warmth on your skin from the heated stone. You drift off with your senses full, your body briefly convinced that comfort is possible. But the truth is that these pleasures were fragile. Heat vanished quickly. Drinks cooled, and before midnight the room could be ice again. These rituals offered no permanent solution, only a psychological grace, short moments that made endless cold bearable. So as you rest tonight, consider how deeply medieval people longed for warmth. They invented clever tools, hunted temporary pleasures, and turned even a hot drink into a survival tactic. Their nights were not effortless, but they were resourceful. And every bath, every stone, every swallow of beer was a small rebellion against the cold. Even after a bath, a heated stone, or a spiced drink, medieval sleepers didn't rely on practicality alone. Cold wasn't just a physical enemy, it could also feel spiritual, even supernatural. Night was dangerous. People suspected the air itself could carry sickness and malice. So they reached for charms, rituals, and folk protections while they slept. One frequently recorded practice was hanging amulets above the bed. These might be simple carved wooden crosses, tiny relics believed to hold a saint's power, or little pouches tied with herbs. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were favorites, thought to repel not only evil spirits but also the poisonous night air. Imagine lying beneath a canopy where scented bundles hang overhead, their sharp scent mixing with hearth smoke and the musky breath of wool. Prayers were another shield. Monastic rules encouraged psalms before bed, and noble families repeated the Paternoster or the Ave Maria at the bedside. But peasants, too, whispered half prayers and half spells, crossing themselves against cold and fire alike. Some murmured verses over children, kissed their foreheads, and tried to keep away the nightmare, the choking presence believed to sit on sleepers' chests. A fascinating detail from a 15th-century German household manual advises sleepers to place iron objects, like a knife or shears, under the bed or pillow. Iron, they believed, could drive away fairies or spirits that slipped into rooms during the long dark hours. The metal would catch a faint glint in firelight, a silent sentry against invisible intruders. There were rituals tied directly to warmth as well. One folk belief held that turning your shoes upside down beside the bed would keep the cold from biting your toes. Another claimed that whispering the names of 3 saints before blowing out the candle would stop your body heat from escaping in the night. Today these can sound like quaint superstitions. For them, they could feel as vital as an extra blanket. Researchers are divided on how seriously such practices were taken. Some say amulets and prayers were sincere habits woven deeply into daily life. Others argue they functioned more like custom, gestures performed because tradition demanded them, even if belief wavered. Either way, the rituals reveal the same core idea: sleep was not fully trusted. Sleep was a vulnerable state where cold, illness, and spirits might strike. People felt they needed protection in both body and soul. Now imagine yourself in a medieval bed. Curtains drawn, fire low, the room full of shadow. A sprig of juniper hangs above, its sharp scent cutting through smoky air. A small iron knife rests beneath your pillow, hidden, but oddly reassuring. You whisper a prayer in a soft rhythm, then cross yourself as you pull the blanket tighter. The night feels less hostile, as if ritual has drawn a thin circle of safety around your fragile body. The sensory details deepen it: herbs rustling against the canopy, the faint metallic tang near your head, wool warming where it touches skin, and the last echo of your whispered words hanging in the room. In that moment, faith, superstition, and survival knot together. Peasants did similar things with simpler materials. Instead of relics, they hung rough charms, carved wooden tokens, knotted cords, or plain herbs gathered from fields. Parents tucked garlic beneath children's pillows, believing it drove off sickness and spirits alike. Even animals entered this mental world. Cows and sheep in nearby stalls were sometimes blessed before nightfall, their presence thought to strengthen the home against winter. Across every class, cold nights were met not only with cloth and fire, but with ritual. The medieval mind sought warmth in the body and safety in the unseen. To sleep was to step into a mystery where prayer and herb, iron and flame, all worked together. Now pull back from the bed and look at the room as a whole. Beyond blankets, dogs, and amulets, architecture itself shaped how bearable a night could be. Castles were built for defense first. But over time, builders experimented with ways to make interiors more livable. The result was a patchwork of solutions, some genuinely clever, others mostly symbolic, trying to carve warmth out of stone. One such space was the sola, a private chamber reserved for the lord and family. Unlike the vast Great Hall, the sola was smaller, higher in the building, and easier to warm. It often had its own fireplace, thick hangings on the walls, and windows angled toward sunlight. By modern standards, it wasn't luxurious. It was strategic. Reduce the volume of a room and the fire's heat has a better chance of staying put. Tapestries went beyond decoration. These heavy woven panels, wool or sometimes silk, covered walls with color and story, saints, hunts, mythical beasts. But they also acted as insulation. Servants struggled to hang them, because a single piece could span many meters and weigh a great deal. Behind them the damp stone was hidden, and the air nearest the wall felt marginally less brutal. Move close enough and you might catch the lanolin-rich smell of wool, earthy, faintly comforting. Archaeological work suggests many rooms used timber paneling for the same reason. Oak boards created a buffer layer, trapping air pockets and making spaces feel less like caves. Servants stuffed cracks with moss, cloth scraps, or hair bundles to choke off drafts. The result was never perfect, but it shows how hard people worked to turn an inhospitable fortress into a home. Estate records reveal another telling detail: nobles carried their best tapestries from castle to castle, as if transporting portable walls. These were not only artworks. They were survival gear. A lord traveling without hangings could feel as exposed as a soldier without armor. Experts still argue how effective these architectural measures truly were. Some say they genuinely reduced drafts and helped hold heat. Others claim the biggest change was psychological. Entering a room glowing with bright fabric and firelight could feel warmer, even if the actual temperature barely shifted. That debate highlights a crucial medieval truth: perception and survival often overlapped. Now imagine stepping into such a room. The door closes behind you, and the corridor's wind howl softens. Walls are covered in red and gold hangings, their woven figures half-lit by candlelight. A carved stone hearth flickers, smoke curls upward. Above, the ceiling is lower than the Great Hall, making the space feel closer, more private. It is still cold. Your breath still shows. But compared to the open chambers below, it is less hostile. The sensations layer together: the rough leaf under your hand, the mingled smell of wool and smoke, the crackle of flames striking oak. For a moment you almost believe you found a refuge, though the cold waits just behind the fabric. Peasants imitated this in simpler ways. Instead of tapestries, they smeared walls with clay and straw, then hung coarse wool or patched cloth to cut the draft. A bright, roughly painted strip of fabric could be both decoration and insulation. In their own style, they turned bare walls into a protective shell and made a room feel smaller, more livable. Another subtle trick was placing sleeping quarters on upper levels. Heat rising from halls below could offer a tiny advantage. Children sometimes slept in lofts above kitchens; the day's oven warmth lingered there longer. This was less about privacy than about capturing every stray degree of heat. Yet even with all these measures, cold never vanished. At best, it was reduced, never erased. Still, solars, paneling, and heavy hangings reveal a deep desire to make stone habitable. Tonight, as you rest, picture those rooms glowing behind tapestries, the small corners warmed by weak fires, the stone softened by timber and cloth. By our standards they were not cozy. But they were an argument, a layered insistence against frost and winter that said, this space is ours, and here we will endure. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of a medieval bedroom. It isn't the clean, lavender-fresh fantasy of modern linen ads. It's a dense stew of odors that builds the moment you step through a heavy wooden door. To understand how people slept, you have to understand what they breathed, because every inhale reminded them of their conditions. The first smell is almost always smoke. In winter, fires burned constantly, and inefficient chimneys pushed soot back into the room. Walls darkened, air thickened, and the scent sank into blankets and curtains. Even freshly washed linen quickly took on that sharp ash bite. By the time you lay down, smoke has worked its way into hair, clothing, and skin. Then comes damp wool. Blankets, cloaks, and garments rarely dried completely in winter. Moisture bled from stone walls, condensed on surfaces, and seeped into textiles. Wool holds that dampness stubbornly, earthy, lanolin-rich, faintly sour. You pull the blanket to your chin and breathe in fabric that feels warming, but never truly clean. And then there's the smell of straw and rushes. Floors were strewn with them, mattresses were stuffed with them, and they rarely stayed fresh. They were crushed under boots, soaked with spills, and shared with rodents. Rushes turned musty fast. A straw mattress might smell grassy at first, but after weeks it shifted toward sweat and decay. Every time you moved in bed, you released another small puff of that soil-dark scent into the air. A 14th-century household guide even recommends scattering dried herbs over the rushes to sweeten a room: rosemary, lavender, meadow flowers. It might work for a few days. Crushed underfoot, their scents would fade, and the sourness of the old rushes would return. And of course, there was the smell of people. Hygiene was limited, baths were infrequent, and sweat was constant. People slept in layers of clothing that had absorbed the day's odors: leather, wool, unwashed skin. The fact that families, or traveling companions, often shared the same bed made it even more intense. Breathing in a medieval room meant breathing in other people's smell, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Researchers still debate how unbearable these odors really were. Some argue that medieval people barely noticed them because constant exposure made them accustomed. Others insist contemporaries noticed them very well, hence the value placed on herbs, perfumes, and incense. Inventories and medical texts provide more material for the second view. People complained about foul air, searched for remedies, and tried to take precautions. The very existence of the debate shows this much: smell was not secondary. It was central to medieval sleep. Now imagine yourself in such a room. The fire is dying, all that remains is the bitter sharpness of smoke. A damp wool blanket itches your chin. The straw beneath you releases a musty breath with every movement. The rushes on the floor rustle faintly as mice scurry among crumbs. The person beside you exhales, warm, but heavy with sweat and beer. Over everything, a very faint trace of rosemary, sprinkled days ago, drifts through the air, able to mask that thick stew of odors only slightly. You breathe more shallowly, as if you want to hold your breath until sleep finally comes. This was normal. This was life. Peasants lived the same reality on a smaller scale. And their cottages were filled with animal smells, because animals often shared the same structure. Cows, sheep, chickens, each added its own scent to the mixture. Travelers from the city found it unbearable, but peasants accepted it as the cost of survival. Even so, herbs were used here too. Bundles of mint or chamomile hung from the beams, both for scent and to keep pests away. Among the nobility, perfumes and incense could sometimes improve the air a little. Resins burned in incense burners released sweet fragrances, though they mixed oddly with smoke and dampness. Scented oils rubbed into clothing or linens created small pockets of pleasantness within the heavy atmosphere. Still, even the richest room could not fully escape the fundamental smell of medieval life. So when you imagine sleeping in a castle, do not picture crisp ironed linen and clean air. Picture smoke, damp wool, straw, sweat, herbs, and animals, blended together. Every night, every breath reminded you where you lived and what you endured. Smell was as much a part of medieval sleep as blankets or fire. Perhaps, over time, the familiarity of those smells became a kind of comfort. To breathe in smoke, wool, and straw was to breathe in home. For a medieval person, smell was not only discomfort, it was an identity woven into the dream of every night. After the smoke, damp wool, and moldy straw, another force mattered in getting through the night: food and drink. You might not think of supper as part of sleep, but what you ate before bed, and the warmth it gave from the inside, could be as important as any blanket. In winter, households relied on thick, filling pottages, hearty soups made from barley, peas, and root vegetables, simmered slowly in large cauldrons like dense stews. These meals clung to the body, leaving a heavy fullness that made the cold more bearable. The heat of the soup lingered in the stomach for a while, spreading outward and convincing you that you could endure a little longer in a frozen room. A noble household might enrich it with meat, spices, or cream. Peasants made do with onions, cabbage, and whatever they had. A curious note in a 15th-century English manuscript claims that eating leeks at night warms the belly and drives away the cold of death. Whether or not that was true, it shows how strongly people linked nourishment with warmth and survival. Hot food was not merely nutrition, it was insulation from the inside out. Drinks mattered just as much. The most common was ale, a fermented grain drink, consumed by rich and poor alike. In winter it was served warm, filling the belly with calories and offering liquid comfort. Spiced wine, hypocras, was a favorite among the nobility, gently heated with spices from distant lands such as cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. Imagine sipping it in a smoky room, exotic spice aromas mixing with wool and ash, sweetness warming your throat, loosening you and drawing you towards sleep. A record attributed to the French court in the time of Charles V notes that the king's physician recommended warm meads at night to keep the cold from penetrating to the bone. The idea is not so far from the modern habit of having tea before bed, except that medieval science justified it through humoral theory, the belief that warm, moist drinks regulated the balance of bodily fluids. Scholars still debate how much heat alcohol truly provided versus how much it merely made people feel warm. Some argue that beer and wine dulled perception, leading sleepers to believe they were warmer than they really were. Others emphasize that these drinks provided real caloric energy, and thus genuine support during long, cold nights. The truth is probably somewhere between, a mix of real internal fuel and psychological easing. Now imagine yourself preparing for bed. A servant hands you warm spiced wine in a wooden cup. Steam rises from the surface, the scent of spices rolls into your nose in waves. You drink, as the liquid slides down your throat, it feels as if you are glowing from within. Your body loosens, your muscles unclench, your eyelids grow heavy. When you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less suffocating, more inviting, as though warmth is no longer in the room, but living inside you. For peasants, the ritual was simpler but no less important. A warm porridge thickened with oats or barley filled the belly. The family gathered around the fire to eat, their faces reddened in the light, their bodies taking on fuels for the long night ahead. Children licked the last scraps from the ends of wooden spoons and curled beneath the blankets. The memory of the meal's warmth made it easier to ignore the draft slipping in through the shutters. There was even a folk belief that eating garlic before bed prevented frostbite. Whether that came from garlic genuinely improving circulation, or simply because it left a burning warmth in the mouth, is unclear, but the habit endured. Farmers in cold regions sometimes chewed cloves of garlic before lying down, the sharp smell spread through the room as forcefully as smoke and wool. The world of pre-sleep food and drink in the Middle Ages is vivid, the cauldron simmering, the hiss of wine warming over the fire, the mingled scents of herbs and spices among damp rushes, the heavy weight of stew settling in the stomach. Every taste was part of the war against cold. So when you think about medieval sleep, do not separate it from the evening meal that came before it. Food was fuel, warmth, even a kind of medicine. Without it, the cold was sharper, the blankets thinner, the night longer. With it, the body endured. Each spoonful, each sip was an invisible but vital inner blanket, a layer of defense against the ice-cold stone that surrounded you. Now think of the most fragile people in a medieval castle, children and the elderly. Their bodies, less able to withstand the cold, bore winter's cruelty most heavily. If a healthy adult knight or servant could shiver through the night and survive, a child might wake with blue lips, and an elderly woman might not wake at all. For these groups, survival depended on extra care, shared support, and sometimes sheer luck. Household records from noble families suggest that children were rarely given separate rooms. Instead, they slept in nurseries close to the warmth of the kitchens, or clustered with servants. Young pages and squires in training often slept together in crowded rooms. Their laughter and whispering at night would be muffled under blankets. The logic was simple: more bodies meant more heat. Babies, especially, were wrapped in layer upon layer of linen and wool. A cradle might be placed near the hearth, and in some cases the baby would be kept in the mother's bed, where the mother's body heat protected it from the frozen air. A poignant account in a 14th-century chronicle describes a noble child laid in a wicker basket cradle by the fire, wrapped in furs with a canopy drawn over it. The detail shows how hard families tried to protect their smallest members. Even so, illness and cold claimed many lives. Medieval parents lived with the constant fear that winter could take a child in the night. The elderly faced similar dangers. Weaker bodies produced less heat and endured drafts less well. In peasant cottages, grandparents often slept closest to the fire while younger adults accepted colder spots. In castles, elderly relatives were moved into smaller rooms, and in the coldest months sometimes even into the kitchen. A letter from Burgundy describes a striking scene: an elderly lady insists on sleeping in the bakehouse, claiming the residual warmth from the oven gives her a second youth. Medical texts of the time offered special precautions for children and the old. Physicians advised placing heated stones wrapped in cloth at the feet, or giving warm drinks to strengthen the humors. Warnings appear repeatedly that sudden chill could extinguish the flame of life, a vivid reminder of how fragile these groups were considered to be. Historians still debate whether medieval families truly granted children and the elderly an extra share of tenderness. Some argue that the emphasis on protecting them reflects deep compassion. Others point to the high death rates and stress the realistic limits of what families could do. This tension between care and inevitability shaped how people understood both childhood and old age. Now imagine a winter night in a peasant cottage. A baby is tightly swaddled, its tiny face barely visible. A grandmother snores softly near the fire, the pale glow of embers reddens her cheeks. The parents pull cloaks over both of them, giving them the warmest places. Children are pressed together on a straw mattress, they giggle until exhaustion quiets them. The room smells of porridge, smoke, and wool, but the warmth of family closeness hangs in the air too. In the castle, the image is different but just as vivid. A nurse rocks a cradle by the hearth, humming a soft lullaby while the child fusses against the cold. Upstairs, an elderly noblewoman demands that the bed curtains be drawn tight as a servant places warm stones at her feet. She clutches her rosary and murmurs prayers, as if afraid of the cold's creeping hand. In both worlds, the youngest and the oldest required the most attention, sometimes even that was not enough. The sensory detail is sharp: the crackle when a new log is thrown on the fire, the soft rustle of swaddling cloth, an old man shifting beneath blankets. The cold feels as if it is waiting for a moment of weakness, a sense of fragility hangs in the air. That is why, when you imagine medieval sleep, you should not think of it as equal for everyone. Children and the elderly carried the heaviest risk, their survival depended on the warmth others provided. On those long nights, every blanket, every ember, every whispered prayer mattered. They remind you that medieval sleep was not only about individual toughness, it was about community, about the labor of carrying the young and the old through winter together. Cold did not only numb skin and bone, it also shaped how people understood health. In the medieval mind, being chilled was not merely discomfort. It was danger, a force that could disrupt the body's internal balance and invite illness inside. Medieval medicine revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed warmth was crucial to keeping these fluids in harmony. In excessive cold, they thought the humors could thicken and congeal, clogging the body and making a person sick. Medical treatises from the 13th and 14th centuries are full of advice on how to manage this problem at night. One handbook recommends rubbing the feet with warm oil before bed, to open the pores and drive harmful cold out. Another advises drinking milk warmed with honey, claiming it calms the stomach and prevents the humors from growing heavy and sluggish. Physicians treated warmth as medicine in its own right, prescribing heat in every form: food, drink, clothing, and even sleeping close to other people. There is also an intriguing note from a French surgeon warning that sleeping in damp rooms could chill the black bile and produce melancholy. As a remedy, he recommends hanging wall tapestries not for beauty, but as a medical necessity. Imagine a doctor telling you, if you don't properly decorate your walls, you'll become depressed. It shows how tightly climate and medicine were intertwined. At the same time, folk remedies multiplied. Some people believed rubbing garlic or onion on the soles of the feet before bed kept the cold from entering the body. Others tied wool soaked in wine around their ankles and treated it like a protective charm. A strange prescription in an English herbal book even suggests keeping a live rooster in the bedroom to draw the frost out of the man within. Whether anyone truly slept with a clucking bird is unclear, but the belief shows how desperate the search for remedies could become. Modern scholars still debate how effective these medieval health practices against cold really were. Some argue that oils, warm drinks, and herbal approaches could modestly improve circulation, or at least provide psychological relief. Others say most of it was symbolic, with limited benefit beyond placebo. The disagreement continues. But one thing is certain: people sincerely believed in the power of these nighttime rituals. Now imagine yourself preparing for bed with this advice in mind. You sit by the fire while a servant massages your feet with warm oil. Rosemary scent spreads through the room. You drink warm wine mixed with honey from a small cup, coating and heating your throat. The sharp-scented bundle of garlic sits near your bed, strange, but placed there to drive off the frost. You climb into bed, convinced that all these remedies will keep your humors in balance until morning. The sensory experience is powerful: the slick warmth of oil on your skin, the sweet bite of honeyed wine, the burning sting of garlic in the air. Every detail reminds you that sleep is not merely a search for comfort, but a medical practice, a night-long therapy against imbalance. Peasants had their own remedies. Women would prepare hot drinks for children from herbs like nettle or chamomile, believing it prevented coughing. Men wrapped their legs in wool soaked in vinegar to keep circulation strong. In cottages, these practices blurred the line between superstition and science. But they gave people a sense of control in the face of illness that seemed inevitable. Of course, the irony is that some strategies against cold created new problems. Fire filled the lungs with smoke, heavy blankets could worsen joint pain, greasy ointments attracted grime. But in the medieval mind, these were small costs compared with the greater danger of cold seeping into the body. Better to cough in a smoky room than freeze in a clean one. So when you picture medieval sleep, do not forget that it was not simply enduring discomfort. It was woven from health theories, odd but familiar remedies, and a constant anxiety that cold could overturn the balance of life in a single night. Every night was a medical event. Every blanket and herb was a prescription, every ember a treatment. To fall asleep was to trust that these efforts would be enough until morning. Even with fires, blankets, herbs, and charms, some nights none of it was enough. Walk into a castle room in the heart of winter and you might meet a strange sight: frost blooming on the inner walls like flowers. Imagine lying in bed and noticing fine lace-like traces of ice forming on the stone, or waking to find the water in your basin completely frozen. the water becomes a glassy block. Cold did not politely remain outside, it entered, and decorated rooms with its own ruthless art. Chroniclers record mornings when entire households woke to frost on their bed curtains. In a letter, a noblewoman writes that her canopy glittered as if embroidered with silver, because the moisture of her own breath crystallized overnight. It sounds poetic to us. To her, it was bitter proof of how unlivable even a furnished room could be. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Salt traces and damp stains in some preserved castles suggest how water condensed on walls and floors. With no insulation, warm indoor air met ice-cold stone and frost formed. Servants scraped the ice away in the mornings, but it returned every night. There is also an unusual anecdote from Scandinavia. In some great halls, icicles formed indoors along beams, and when they melted they dripped onto sleepers below. Servants hung cloths to catch the meltwater, an improvised solution to a chilling problem. How widespread this was remains debated. Some think indoor frost was more typical of northern Europe in harsh winters. Others argue that even in milder regions, poorly heated stone rooms could easily drop to freezing. The truth is likely both. The severity varied by region, but waking up to ice inside the room was never far-fetched. Now put yourself there. You wake at dawn in grey half-light, your breath hangs like mist. The bed curtains are stiff, edged with ice crystals. When you reach for the basin you touch ice instead of water. Your joints ache, the thought of leaving the cover feels like punishment. The sensory detail is sharp, the sting of frozen fabric against skin, the brittle creak of frost-tightened wood, the thin drip of melting ice as the only sound cutting the silence. Peasants suffered similar problems, only in different forms. In cottages, frost coated the inner faces of the thatch roof and beams, it could fall like snow inside during the night. Some children woke with frost in their hair. Parents joked darkly that they were sleeping with clouds inside the house. But humor could not hide the hardship. Freezing, chilblains, and respiratory illness followed. Even nobles could not fully escape. Warm stones and furs might keep the body alive, but the surrounding air remained hostile. Diaries even hint at the psychological burden. People dreaded the moment they had to leave the bed in the morning, because the rest of the room felt too brutal to face. An English poet turns it into metaphor, making a bed without frost inside it a symbol of love. For him, true closeness meant defeating the night's cold, creating warmth where the world offered only ice. It shows how the experience of cold shaped not only reality, but imagination. So when you think of medieval sleep, remember that surreal beauty too, cold working its way into rooms like ornament. Living in a castle meant sharing the same space with ice every morning, seeing again how stone and frost conspired against comfort. And still people endured, scraping ice away, piling on layers, whispering prayers, and facing mornings that felt as harsh indoors as out. Now imagine yourself not in a castle, but on the road. Medieval travel was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. And when night fell, the problem of warmth became sharper. Castles had fireplaces and tapestries, peasants had the family hearth. But travelers, pilgrims, merchants, wandering knights, had nowhere to retreat. If they found shelter at all, it was usually an inn. A medieval inn was not the cozy picture you might imagine. Often it was a wooden building with a smoky hall, crowded rooms, and beds shared with strangers. Guests might squeeze 3 or 4 to a single mattress, blankets were thin, privacy did not exist. And yet inns offered one critical thing: heat. The fire in the main hall burned for everyone, and the press of bodies multiplied warmth. A traveler in 15th century Italy complains that the beds were alive with vermin, but admits that the presence of other guests at least prevented him from freezing. Imagine climbing onto a straw mattress, wedging yourself between two strangers, your nostrils filling with the smell of beer and sweat. Miserable, yes, but your toes would make it to morning. There were stranger lodgings too. Some inns were so poorly equipped that guests slept in stables. At first it seems humiliating, but travelers sometimes preferred it. Horses and cattle gave off heat. A stable full of animals could be far warmer than a drafty upstairs room. Pilgrims on the road to Santiago sometimes wrote that they deliberately chose stalls, curling into hay bales beside animals, their breath mingling with the animals' breath. The smell was sharp, but the warmth was undeniable. In the countryside, hospitality rested on older customs. Especially for pilgrims or travelers bearing religious signs, opening the door was expected. A peasant family might offer a corner by the fire or a place on a straw mattress. The warmth here came not from luxury, but from generosity and closeness. You sleep shoulder to shoulder with strangers, listening to the crackle of a modest hearth, breathing in the stew smell still clinging to the rafters. A 14th-century French record describes communal inns, long wooden platforms covered with straw, where dozens of travelers lay side by side, men and women alike. The crowding that would unsettle us today was normal then. Shared warmth overwhelmed the awkwardness. Researchers debate whether such inns were more comfortable than castles. Some say yes, crowded and filthy as they were, they held heat better than enormous noble rooms. Others point to dangers, lice, fleas, theft, and argue that a castle's cold at least came with security. Both views are true. For the exhausted medieval traveler, survival often meant choosing between two evils, cold solitude or crowded misery. Now picture yourself inside that inn. You enter the hall and are hit by a roar of voices and the surge of the fire. The smells of beer, smoke, and roasted meat fall on you like a weight. Someone makes a space for you on a straw mattress, you squeeze in among strangers. The floor creaks, dogs bark, cups clink, but the warmth of the crowd loosens your limbs. Then the hall quiets, laughter gives way to snoring, embers glow dimly in the hearth. You feel the heat of bodies beside you. It is not comfort as you know it, but it is enough. The sensory details are precise, straw pricking through thin linen, the heavy stink of sweat and smoke, the rhythmic breathing of a dozen sleepers. You shift carefully, trying not to wake your neighbors, and the inn's murmur draws you into a shallow but necessary sleep. Even traveling nobles could not avoid this. Royal processions required huge entourages, inns filled quickly. Records describe rulers lodging in monasteries, or effectively taking over an entire inn for their household. But even a king could not escape the basic hardship, warmth was scarce, and the road stripped away layers of privilege. Do not forget the traveler in the fabric of medieval sleep. For him, every night was uncertain, every bed a gamble, a verminous mattress, a stable full of horses, the floor of a stranger's house, or, if fortune smiled, a monastery guest hall. Wherever it was, the goal was the same, to trap enough heat to make it to morning. Every household found ways to endure, but not everyone succeeded. The Middle Ages also left half history, half legend stories about nights so cold, told like cautionary tales. Sleeping in a castle meant fighting an invisible enemy, and sometimes the cold one. A bleak chronicle describing a 13th-century siege in Flanders claims that guards posted on the walls froze solid at their stations during a bitter winter night. At dawn their comrades found them still upright, spears in hand, bodies turned to ice. The writer presents it not merely as tragedy, but as evidence of winter's cruelty, as if cold itself were a weapon of war. Imagine the horror of seeing men transformed into statues overnight, watchfires extinguished. Other accounts are softer and more personal. A Burgundian noblewoman's letter describes an Italian cousin who shivered all night and begged for mercy in the morning. He had never known such bitter cold. He survives, and the story is retold with laughter, they mock his weakness, while quietly acknowledging the knight's relentless fear. A Scandinavian folk tale is stranger still. A bride collapses from the cold the moment she enters her new husband's castle. Villagers whisper that northern ice spirits have cursed her. Whether she dies from illness or chill is unclear, but the story lives on as a warning that stone walls and winter winds could test even a marriage. How literally we should take these stories is debated. Were they exaggerated for dramatic effect, turning ordinary hardship into legend? Or are they accurate records of how, in an uninsulated age, freezing and hypothermia truly caused severe losses? Some argue chroniclers exaggerated to teach moral lessons. Others say the tales reflect a harsher climate reality than we know today. Now imagine yourself in the Great Hall listening to these stories. The fire burns low. Shadows twitch on the wall. An old servant tells of a knight who trusted too much in too few blankets and died in his sleep. Children widen their eyes and pull their cloaks tighter. These stories are not merely entertainment. They are warnings. If you do not take the cold seriously, it will take you. Travel accounts carry the same warning tone. Pilgrims write of companions lost in mountain passes, bodies found in spring as if still sleeping. Soldiers on campaign speak of comrades who do not rise in the morning, their cloaks stiff with frost. In the cold, the line between sleep and death was thin. The sensory reality of such nights is terrifying, air that cuts bare skin like a burn, numbness creeping into fingers and toes, the fear that you will close your eyes and not open them again. Lying down in a frozen room was a gamble. The stakes were blankets, fire, and prayer. The reward was survival. Yet alongside these dark tales were stories of endurance. Peasants took pride in winters survived in humble cottages through closeness and fire. Nobles treated hunting and feasting in midwinter as proof of conquering the season. Against the stories of loss, there was a quiet language of victory too. Surviving was an achievement in itself. Perhaps that is why the tale of frozen nights endured. It reminded people that castles, for all their power, were not invincible. Stone walls could stop armies, but they could not stop winter. In the long darkness of night, even the mightiest lord needed blankets, fire, and companions, just like the poorest peasant. When you imagine medieval sleep, hold both truths together, the stories of those who froze, and the silent triumph of those who endured. Every story carries a lesson: respect the night, stay alert to the cold, and never assume survival is guaranteed. And in the end, you return to the hearth, the symbol that drew every medieval sleeper into its light. Fire was never only a tool. It was the heart of the household. In winter nights it was the border between life and death. Its light threw shadows onto the walls. As flames rose and fell, the shadows moved like watchmen. To sleep in a castle was to live in dialogue with the fire. You feared it. You needed it. Without it, you could not live. The hearth seized every sense. The crackle of oak logs echoed in the room like a heartbeat. Sparks leapt upward, leaving thin trails of light before vanishing. The scent of burning resin soaked into tapestries and hair. Heat came in waves, scorching your face while your back froze. The hearth was a paradox, savior and tormentor, life-giver and smoky tyrant. For nobles, a roaring hearth was a sign of status. It meant having servants assigned to gather endless fuel, even consuming forests if necessary. It meant keeping the flame alive through the night. Some households even appointed firekeepers whose only task was to ensure the embers never died. Letting the hearth go out was not merely discomfort, it was a loss of reputation. But the poorest gathered around their small fires with the same reverence. Peasants crouched on earthen floors, pressed together with family and animals, watching flames lick rough logs. They laughed, told stories, prayed, and shared pots of stew. There was no grandeur of carved stone chimneys, but the comfort was no less real. In castle and cottage alike, fire brought people together and made sleep possible. A traveler in Germany describes a striking scene. Peasants form a circle around the hearth before bed, stretching their hands toward the flames and whispering for blessing, as if the fire itself were holy. They believe the flames carry their hopes into the night and protect them as they sleep. It shows how practical necessity turned into ritual. Fire was not only heat, it was spirit, memory, belief. Historians argue over how much of this was practical and how much symbolic. Some say it was survival instinct dressed in tradition. Others insist fire truly held spiritual meaning, woven into cosmology and daily prayer. Perhaps it was both. Medieval people lived so close to danger that fire naturally became more than fuel, it became meaning itself. Now return one last time to your imagined castle. The bed curtains are drawn, blankets piled high. Outside, wind hammers the towers. Snow taps at the shutters with a faint hiss, the night presses down with all its weight. But in the great hearth, embers still glow, and their pale light slips through the gaps in the curtain. You close your eyes, you hear the low sigh of the fire, and you know that this thin line of heat is what holds the frost back. The sensory tableau completes itself: smoke on your tongue, the weight of wool and fur across your chest, the warmth of a dog curled at your feet, the echo of a prayer in your mind. As you drift toward sleep, you understand that in the Middle Ages sleep was never easy, never certain, but it was always fought for, using every trick, every ritual, and every scrap of warmth. In the end, castles were fortresses against people, but not against winter. What saved those inside was not stone or steel, but endurance, invention, community. To make it through the night was to fold blankets, share heat, feed fire, and cling to hope. Against the endless medieval cold, the truest fire was the human one. Now soften the rhythm. Picture the embers' dim light, no longer harsh, but like a tired warmth resting after long labor. The room is quiet, the wind beyond the walls has retreated into the distance. The weight of blankets presses you into the bed, protective, heavy. The battles with cold, the vigil of the fire, the sounds of dogs and servants, all of it recedes, as though a curtain has been drawn over the world. Your breathing slows. Each inhale carries a faint taste of smoke and wool. Each exhale dissolves into the still air. Sounds that once echoed, footsteps on stone, shutters creaking, monastery hymns, are now only whispers in memory. Even the castle seems to sleep, its stones hold silence like a vow. You think you are safe in your cocoon. A dog at your feet sighs and shifts. The last candle dwindles and goes out, darkness falls over you like one more blanket. The cold is still there, yes, but you are no longer fighting it. You accept it, as people did then, knowing that sleep is a fragile truce. With the night, your body grows heavy. Thoughts dissolve into shapes and colors. The smoky, cold medieval world drifts away like frost melting in sun. What remains is stillness. You are warm enough, safe enough, tired enough. And the story closes. The hearth trembles softly, the bed holds you, and the long night carries you slowly into dream. Now rest as they did, wrapped in a quiet resilience. Sweet dreams.